Good morning, everyone. Hello, and welcome to our second session in our Adolescent Reproductive Health Office Hours webinar series. My name is Catherine Walsh, and I am a Program Officer with the Challenge Initiative, an urban reproductive health program with a specific focus on youth. We're currently working in Francophone West Africa, Nigeria, East Africa, and India. Our hope for this webinar series is to share best practices in working with this often hard to reach group. So today we will hear from the highly regarded adolescent health expert, Dr. Robert Blum, who is the principal investigator for the Global Early Adolescent Study, which seeks to understand the factors that predispose youth ages 10 to 14 to sexual health risks. Dr. Blum is a professor and former department chair in the Department of Population, Family, and Reproductive Health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He is also director of the Johns Hopkins Urban Health Institute and former president of the Society for Adolescent Medicine. Dr. Blum will talk for about 35 minutes so that there's time for questions at the end. Please feel free to type questions in the chat box throughout the presentation, and we will try to get to them all during the Q&A session. If we don't get to your question, we will try to respond to them in a follow-up email that will include a recording of this webinar and Dr. Blum's presentation. Thank you all for being here, and Dr. Blum, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to present and share a bit on the Global Early Adolescent Study. A bit of background, and then let's dive in. In 2009 and 2010, the World Health Organization held a couple of consultations. The first looking at what would be the priorities for research in adolescent sexual and reproductive health for the next decade. We're almost at the end of that decade now. And the second was to dig more deeply into the recommendations. So the recommendations were to focus on 10 to 14-year-olds and then subsequently to focus on gender. There are many reasons why we focused on gender. Some were pragmatic, some were based on the literature. First of all, the 10 to 14 age group has been basically ignored in research. That's begun to shift now, and in programming. And thankfully, we have seen over the last 5-7 years a significant increase in programming for young adolescents. We know that gender norm acquisition begins long before adolescence. It begins in infancy, if not before, and in how boys and girls are socialized from early childhood. But the literature is also really clear that gender norms become solidified through puberty and into middle adolescence. It is much harder to shift those norms, those attitudes and beliefs when you're 18, 20, 24 years of age than it is for younger adolescents. So we see young adolescents, 10 to 14 years of age, as a window of opportunity. Additionally, we know that the age of puberty is declining, and that's true in industrialized countries, and it is true in low and middle income countries as well. And there are many factors that are going into this declining age. It's probably different in high income than low and middle income countries. The good news in low and middle income countries is that these declines are predominantly a function of improved quality of health, health status, nutrition, and sanitation. These are major drivers. So the age of puberty has declined, and it makes these issues and issues related to sexual and reproductive health uh, even more uh, pressing. So you set out to understand the factors in early adolescence that shape healthy development in the adolescent years. And I'll talk more specifically about the exact factors we're looking at momentarily. Wanted to establish a longitudinal research study to be able to look at similarities and differences globally and to evaluate the impact of gender transformative interventions. When we began this work, a number of people, including people that we approach as potential donors to this work, uh, said, why bother? You know, there is really nothing that young people in New Orleans have in common with young people in Kinshasa. It is all local, it is all cultural. And I was reminded when I heard these responses of when I lived and worked in Minnesota. And people in Iowa or in Nebraska or Wisconsin would say, well, your data is from Minnesota. It has no applicability to young people in our state. We all believe that all of the issues that we face are unique and are local. And that may well be true. But in truth, we were interested in asking the question, are there commonalities that transcend geography? And what are the consequences of that? From a programmatic perspective, I would suggest that's very important. Because if everything is local and unique, then you have to develop local and unique programs, and there's little to be garnered or gained from looking at successful programming elsewhere. But if there are commonalities, then there's a lot to be gained from that global orientation. So these are the things we were interested in. The problem that we faced was that there had been very little research with 10 to 14-year-olds and next to nothing done around gender norms. And we spent the better part of 5 years developing the measures. We started out our work, researchers dreaming up questions and ideas and measures. We started with young people and their parents or guardian. So in every single site, of which there were 15 in the initial work that we did, we spoke to approximately 30 to 35 young people and a parent or guardian. So we had these dyads of young people and a parent or guardian together. And uh, our questions were quite open ended. We were interested in understanding uh, how things changed over time and what uh, the issues were that parents and young people experience. We were interested in understanding the messages that boys and girls got about being a gendered individual. How were girls in the family treated differently than boys, etc. From that work, we did a few things. One is that we published a special supplement in the Journal of Adolescent Health, which is uh, open source, publicly available. That came out in September of 2017. We also developed three measures or scales, and I'll come to that in a second. And what we have done recently is write and have either published or soon to be published a series of methodologic papers on the measures that we developed. Uh, so that formed the base of our initial work. Then, starting about a year ago, we began to move into the longitudinal phase of our work. And we have now collected baseline data with approximately 15,000 kids in 7 countries, 7 sites, and are in the process of collecting more baseline data. The questions that we're centrally interested in with the longitudinal phase of the GES is what are the factors that relate to gender equal and unequal norms? What are the similarities across very divergent geographies, and what are the differences? I should mention, because it's, among other things, particularly relevant to the Challenge Initiative, all of our sites are in low-income urban areas. So we are in the poorest sections of the communities in which we are based. We're secondly interested in how gender norms and perceptions of gender equality change and evolve over time, and thus the longitudinal nature of those who, for example, espouse to gender equality at the age of 13, still orienting in the same kinds of ways at the age of 17 or 18. Additionally, we're interested not only in attitude change, which has been the hallmark of a fair amount of work that has been done in gender norm change. We are fundamentally interested in behavior change. For example, is there less interpersonal violence and gender-based violence that occurs? In some of our sites, for example, in Kinshasa, in Indonesia, in New Orleans, there are interventions, and we're interested in understanding how these interventions shift gender norms in our populations, and how do they impact the health trajectories of young people who receive them. So the instruments that we developed over this 5-year period of time, one was a gender norm scale instrument. And the way that we developed that was through these qualitative interviews with young people. We recorded them, translated them, transcribed them, and then analyzed them for all of the gendered messages that they received. And through a laborious process, we came up with a gender norms measure that we were able to validate across the globe. As I said, in what wound up being 14 sites on 5 continents. We developed a measure of gender equality. And here we use vignettes to tap young people's thinking about relationships and gender equality in relationships. And the third instrument is a health and behavior measure instrument. This has 10 components to it. It has physical health, sexual and reproductive health, mental health. It has there's a module on family, on peers, on school or work. There's a module on neighborhood. There's a module on adverse child experiences. It is pretty expansive and fairly long, but it taps a broad set of dimensions of health. In our work, we are fundamentally interested in 5 areas. I mentioned a moment ago interpersonal violence and gender-based violence. And the reason why we're interested in both of those is because the literature indicates that girls tend to be more victimized by gender-based violence and boys by interpersonal violence. So we're interested in both. We're interested in sexual and reproductive health pretty much in a straight up and straightforward way, as you all would understand it. We also have a concept of healthy sexuality, which is not about sexual behavior, but about body comfort, pubertal satisfaction, transitions into and through adolescence. We're interested in mental health. And I would mention that based on our pilot and preliminary work, we have become aware that mental health issues are far more salient than we had anticipated. So we had built in a 6 item index of depressive symptoms. Uh, we have more recently added a second measure, which uses a standardized measure for anxiety, the GAD, the General Anxiety Disorder Scale. We are also now validating our depression index on a totally different project using a clinical validation as well as comparing it to a much larger depression measure called the DISC, DISC. Um, and the final outcome of interest is school retention and school completion. And the factors associated with that, and to what extent do these interventions that aim for increasing gender equality impact these outcomes. The longitudinal research that we are doing currently includes Shanghai, 3 sites in Indonesia, Denpasar in Bali, Lampung and Samarang. So it goes from Bali to Java to Sumatra. Uh, uh, Blantyre in Kenya, Cape Town, Kinshasa, Nairobi in Belgium, Ghent and Antwerp. In the United States, our single site is New Orleans, Cuenca in Ecuador, Santiago in Chile, and most recently, Sao Paulo, Brazil, has joined the GEAS. In each of our sites, the study design involves uh, a minimum of 1,400 young people, 10 to 14 years of age. For those of you who are interested in the research side of this, we powered this study. Remember, we're interested in outcomes, but some of the outcomes in 10 to 14-year-olds are pretty low occurring. So, for example, pregnancy, really low occurring in our age group, but gender-based and interpersonal violence is not. And so the reason why they're 1,400 is that we needed and want to wind up in each site with a usable sample of about 900 young people over 3+ rounds of data collection. Where we have interventions, there's in each place, there's an intervention population and a control population. So a minimum of 2,800 young people. as I said, these are urban, low-income sections of the city. Uh, in all but one of our sites, young people are recruited from schools. And the reason is that in everywhere, with the exception of Kinshasa, somewhere between 90 and 95% of young people are at the age of 10, 11, 12, 13, are in school of some type or another. That begins to change as they get older, and we wanted to follow them. That wasn't true in Kinshasa. About 30% of young people 10 years of age are not in school. And we have an out of school subsample, both in the intervention and control group there, about 400 in each of those subsamples. And then our goal is to do between 3 and 5 rounds of data collection over a 4 to 6 year period of time. So let me share with you a couple of things in the time that we have. The one is that I'll talk about is measuring empowerment. And Katie, I will come to your question as well as others after I go through the presentation. Um, through uh, uh, a review of the literature and the qualitative work. Um, and through piloting, we came up with a essentially or structures that allow you to actualize the agency that you might have. So that's how we have thought about empowerment. So, what are some of the things that we're seeing? What I'm sharing with you is our preliminary baseline data from 3 sites. from Kinshasa in the DR Congo, Shanghai in China, and Cuenca in Ecuador. 3 continents, 3 different cultures, and 3 different geographies. So when we look at freedom of movement, what we see is that in Kinshasa, whether you're a boy or you're a girl, freedom of movement is significantly constrained. Now, for boys, somewhat higher than it is for girls. But 2.52 for boys, 2.42 for girls, the differences are not vast. And then Cuenca is in between Kinshasa and Shanghai. And again, we see higher for boys under freedom of movement. Um, Freedom of movement is in part a measure of, of empowerment and does reflect certain gender norms, but there are also other factors that interact. Um, all of our settings are poor and low income. Some of our settings are far more violent and far more dangerous than some of our other settings. And constraints on movement, both for boys and girls, may reflect those contextual factors. Uh, uh, we see that uh, for example, uh, with uh, Kinshasa um, there are boy girl difference. Slightly higher for boys, not vast differences. We see almost no difference for boys and girls in Shanghai, and almost no difference in voice for boys and girls in Cuenca. I would also mention, interestingly, that for the out of school youth in Kinshasa, and as I said, that's the only site where we have out of school youth, what we see is that girls uh, indicate that they have more voice than do boys. For decision making, again, we see almost no difference between boys and girls in each of the three sites. When we look at the relationships uh, uh, here in terms of uh, agency uh, by domain, I'm not going to go into too much detail. Here. because I want to focus on some of the consequence of this as we go forward. What we see here is the relationship between voice, that subscale, and I would tell you all of these subscales work extremely well across sites, um, and communication about sexual and reproductive health. So here we ask about communication with an adult about sexual relationships, pregnancy, and contraception. And what we see is that for both Kinshasa and Cuenca, uh, there is a strong positive relationship at a very significant level, p less than 0.001, very significant level for discussions about sexual relationships and contraception. In all of our sites, there is no relationship with discussions about pregnancy. But very honestly, I think this reflects the age group that we're focused on, where pregnancy isn't such a predominant issue. When we look at the relationship between communication about sexual relationships, pregnancy, and contraception, and decision making, the ability to make choices that govern your life, we see across sites and across those issues a pretty strong relationship. For some, stronger than others. For example, the relationship between decision making and communications about sexual relationships than for other issues. But there are pretty strong uh, uh, associations here. So, um, what we come away with is a preliminary sense that these dimensions, particularly voice and decision making, and to a lesser extent, freedom of movement, is relevant not only for understanding uh, uh, adolescent interactions generally, but issues related to sexual and reproductive health more specifically. Let me turn to one other area before I then stop and open it to comments and questions. Uh, we looked at adverse child experiences, and this is the largest study that includes ACEs uh, uh, that has been done globally. And let me just say, I would make an argument whether you're doing
Okay, so I'll start feeding you some of the excellent questions that were asked while you were presenting. So this question comes from Dominic Shatuk. So why label the measures empowerment? Why not just refer to them as the three topics: movement, voice, decision? This construct label is overused and varies too much across all literature.
So we use it in a very specific kind of way, and they are interrelated, as I have tried to show you. So they can you take these as separate? Yes. But when you look at the literature, which we have spent a massive amount of time doing, and when you think about what does empowerment mean for young adolescents, it's very different than what it means for 20 to 25-year-olds. For older adolescents, there's a meaning for example, for economic empowerment. Economic empowerment really doesn't have much meaning for young adolescents. Uh, Another would be family decision making. Family decision making doesn't have much meaning for young adolescents, but these constructs do. And so that's why we use them together. Back to you.
Thank you so much. So we have a question from Sandrine. So her question is, could you please explain the choice of the urban area? Gender norms are particularly strong and restrictive in rural areas too.
So as I indicated, there's some practical reasons for a lot of what we do, and there's some theoretical reasons. The theoretical reason is that about 70% of all young people in the world live in cities, and that number is growing. So rural to urban migration is really the trend that has been going on for about 30 years and is a trend that'll continue. That said, we're well aware of the fact that in many places, they are not going to be urbanized for a very long time. We work in Malawi, for example, and that's predominantly rural and will be for an extended period of time. But the pragmatic reason is how this work is funded. And it would be fair to say it's funded A, on a shoestring, and B, site by site. So why are we in the geographies that we're in? The, the answer to that is extremely pragmatic. One or another donor has a particular interest in a given country, uh, and we have collaborators and partners who work there. Secondly, um, as we've thought about it, we wanted a broader geography. Doing a project like this in and of itself is expensive. We would have liked very much, and we still would like to have rural populations. But at the present time, we haven't had the financial support to allow for it. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you. So two questions. One of them is from Katie Meyer. So her question is, have you considered expanding your study to include a fragile humanitarian site? And then similarly, another question, why multiple sites only in a couple countries? I think it was in Indonesia and the Netherlands.
We're in multiple sites in only one country, and that's Indonesia. And there are a few reasons for that. But remember, there are a lot of pragmatic factors that enter into doing a project like this. So there's tremendous cultural, religious diversity in Indonesia. One can easily say it's the largest Muslim country in the world, which it is, but It's tremendous variation. Poly
Critics expanding
is
your
not uh, predominant.
and
Um,
from
so
Joanne.
to
Was there
tap
any
some of that
measure if there was
tremendous
any
variation.
influence
Secondly,
on role modeling among the
we
adolescents
had the
involved in the study?
capacity with support from the donor to allow for multiple sites. We simply haven't, up until now, had
So
sufficient resources elsewhere.
I
So
think my
that's why
interpretation is that
multiple sites. There was
was there
another part
any
of the question,
for
Catherine, but forgive
adolescents
my
who had a
break.
role model, was there any positive impact?
Oh yeah, yeah, I'd love to. And this is we have not had any indication of interest. I do have a colleague here at Hopkins, Court Robinson, who's doing a lot of work in humanitarian settings with adolescents, and there was a special supplement of conflict and health that came out about a year ago that I edited that looked at adolescents in refugee camps in three settings. I think that there would be a tremendous opportunity, uh, and I would be enthusiastic about having with
Thank you.
you or
And so,
anyone else
moving on to
interested in that.
uh, your discussion on ACEs, there's a couple questions related to the the differences between girls and boys. So this question from Laurette is: could it be that girls are under social pressure not to complain about any kind of violence?
I must confess I don't understand the question. Was there any influence on? So we have um, we don't have a measure of role modeling. We have a measure of closeness and connection, closeness to connection with parents, closeness and connection with peers, with teachers and other adults in the school, and with adults in the community. So those are the kinds of measures we have. We have yet to analyze the relationships between closeness and connection and our primary outcomes of interest.